All right, so you guys have some videos that I've referred you to online regarding the Phillips curve, but I just wanted to give you this one for some additional support if you need it. There's some stuff in your textbook around page 805. Let me just recall here, 807 rather. So at page 807, you can check out starting with the basics about the Phillips curve, and then there's some more extended explanation. So we're going to start with the Phillips curve. It shows the inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment. It's a curved line, downward sloping. It does not touch the axes. I always draw it as a curve rather than a straight line because I want to show my brain that this graph is visually looking different than just a regular demand line. Okay? So this is called the short run Phillips curve, and it shows that inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation. And as price level starts to fall, unemployment will increase. So if you remember the axes, this should be a 0 down here, and the number line just gets larger. And as more people go to work, then price level is going to increase, and that's because of demand pull inflation. So there's another thing to remember about this graph. I drew a little bubble over here. Remember that the natural rate of unemployment is 4 to 6%. Well, economists have a hard time showing a range on an actual set of axes. So we're going to settle on 5% because it's right in the middle of being the natural rate of unemployment. And when we're operating at the natural rate of unemployment, if I may just use the margin over here, remember, we have that long run aggregate supply, the short run aggregate supply, and then aggregate demand. They come together all at one point. And that also would be the natural rate of unemployment. That would be no cyclical employment, and we would be fully employed. You can show that same exact economy over here. So you just take that long run Phillips curve and draw it down the middle. And you've got your long run Phillips curve intersecting with the short run. And this would be 5%, 2% inflation and 5% unemployment, okay? So economists basically say if we've got around 2% unemployment, this is indicative of a healthy economy. It means people are spending money and businesses are spending money, and there's not so much spending going on that prices are getting out of control and unaffordable. It's just sort of the mark of health, okay? So that there's some lively economic activity occurring. So ultimately what can happen is we can show things that happen in this economy on the Phillips curve or the long run aggregate supply model, okay? So to show a recessionary gap on the short run Phillips curve, remember that you would have unemployment that is higher than the natural rate, and you would also have prices a little bit lower than they should be. So to show a recessionary gap, we would draw a little point to the right of the long run Phillips curve, and this would equal a recessionary gap. If we wanted to show an inflationary gap, we would have prices that are higher than we ordinarily would, and we would also have unemployment lower than the natural rate of unemployment. So we would show a point over here on the inside of the long run Phillips curve, and that shows an inflationary gap. Now remember, inflationary gap doesn't just mean prices are higher. It means that the economy is operating beyond its full capacity. And actually right now, if I was to say in April of 2019, the unemployment rate in the United States is 3.8%. So we probably would show ourselves right here a little bit on the inside of the long run Phillips curve. So these two little points, this orange and the purple, actually coincide with some aggregate demand shifts that would lead to those situations. So going back to my little model over here, if aggregate demand was to shift to the left over here, that would be the same point over here on the Phillips curve. And if aggregate demand from full employment had shifted to the right, that would be the inflationary gap that's over here. So there are some rules about the Phillips curve. If there's a demand shift, okay, so an aggregate demand shift equals a point on the line of the short run Phillips curve. And I always say to people, we demand to be on the line. So that's how we can remember that. Also, if there is a aggregate supply shift, and again, this is in the short run, if this is an aggregate supply shift, things will change a little bit. So if I move over here and I wanted to shift the short run aggregate supply line to the right, I would see that my prices would go down and my unemployment would decrease. So if I start from full employment here to make my prices go down and my unemployment to decrease, I'm no longer on the line. I'm somewhere floating in this space over here. So to show an aggregate supply shift in the short run, we have to move the entire short run Phillips curve and slide it over. So if my short run aggregate supply shifted to the right, then my short run Phillips curve is going to shift to the left. If my short run aggregate supply decreased, so if this little line shifted to the left, I would have higher prices and higher unemployment. If I start from full employment over here and I get higher prices and higher unemployment, again, I'm floating somewhere out here. So a short run aggregate supply shift to the right would be a short run aggregate supply shift to the left rather would be a short run Phillips curve shift to the right. So when we are having a supply shift, we supply a whole new line. So these are just some ways that you can remember the rules. And then the other rule is that on your aggregate supply, aggregate demand, and your Phillips curve, they move in opposite directions. So if you're moving to the left on the aggregate supply, aggregate demand graph, you're going to be moving things to the right on your Phillips curve. If you're moving to the right on your aggregate supply, aggregate demand, you're moving to the left on your Phillips curve. So I always heard that this is like elevator doors. They either move open away from each other or they move closed towards each other. So those are your rules about the Phillips curve. Again, on the line for demand, supply a whole new line for supply. And when you are doing these to check your work, you're very familiar with aggregate supply, aggregate demand. So remember that you might have to just test things out on your little friend over here and then apply them to your Phillips curve to double check. And we're moving away from each other or towards each other, just like elevator doors. Awesome.